morning, everyone. How are you doing? Enjoying the conference so far? Okay, today I will try to present to you Art of Mocking. My name is Bartek Bielawski. I am a PowerShell MVP. I am father of 3 kids. I live in Netherlands, but I'm from Poland originally. And let's mention sponsors. They are the people that are helping us be here and having this great place to meet. So all the sponsors are on the slide, and that's about it when it comes to PowerPoint. Let's move to my presentation tool of choice, PowerShell IC. Let's move that guy over here. Okay. So, the Art of Mocking is the title of the presentation. The idea behind it is that I've been using Pester for a good amount of like 2-3 years. I wouldn't consider myself a Pester expert. So a hint for everybody, if any point in time you can hear somebody doing like this, it's probably, you can spot this person, and first of all, you will probably know that what I'm saying is not correct, and then you can find this person and ask them, what did I do wrong? The second thing is that after presentation from Jakub yesterday, who is actual expert, and you can meet him after this presentation where he has profile session. After presentation from Jakub yesterday, I realized that I've been using Pester 5 for a good amount of a year and a half or so. So most of the experiences nowadays for me is related to Pester 5. So if you're still running Pester 4, most of the things that I will discuss here today will still apply to what your code does. But some things may be different. One thing that I want to point out, if you are still in Pester 4, the mocking is definitely different there. Main reason is that mocks tend to leak outside of the scripts, and we were definitely depending on it. So when we were migrating from Pester 4 to Pester 5, we had to change a lot of things because we are kind of assuming that the things that we define as a mock in the first describe block, they would be appearing somewhere, sometimes even in different test scripts, and they would still leak and work, sort of. So you have to keep that in mind when you are migrating between Pester 5 and Pester 4. But what I will talk about today is my experiences since we moved to Pester 5, so that's what I will focus on. The agenda for today. So first of all, I will try to give you some Pester 101. So my assumption is that most of you guys are using Pester nowadays. Can you raise your hand if you are using Pester? If you are not using Pester yet, you can still stay in the room. I'm not going to kick you out, but it's just that it will be difficult for you to appreciate all the logic and all the things I will do. I still will try to keep at least some, like 2-3 minutes about the Pester itself, so you can at least have a context where that would apply to you. So I will try then to touch on the mocking concept, so what I think mocks should do and how you should do that. Then we will go over some rules, and those rules definitely will be focusing on the Pester 5. So that's where the Pester 5 thing will definitely come in. Then I will try to touch on some pitfalls, some things that I noticed when I was doing my mocking, where some things didn't work the way I would expect them to, or the things that were not behaving the way I would expect them to, or where I was just completely unable to mock certain things, and how we did approach that. After that, I will share with you some ideas that I have, or some tricks that I basically, in our daily, because we work as a team, in our daily operations, we do try to make sure that all of our code that we commit to the production is tested. So obviously, we face a lot of challenges, and then before we had to overcome them, work around them as well. So I'll try to share a few of those ideas that we had while doing so. So that's the plan for today. A few words about me. By the way, all the pictures are drawn by my daughter, Hania. She's 15. So I had in the slide, I have this nice picture that was taken like probably 5 years ago, where I still look nice. I asked her to draw me as I look today. As you can see, there's a slight difference. I mean, you will see that in the materials. Overall, so my name is Bartek Bielawski. You can find me on Twitter under @bielawb. My email is over there as well. I work for Optiver, and by the way, we are hiring heavily. So if you are interested in joining and doing crazy shit like I'm doing, gonna show you today, please hit me up after the presentation. I can give you the card, and you can contact me if you are interested. And you can find most of the things I do or did in the past on the GitHub under the same handle that I have on Twitter. So that's about me. Enough? Okay, let's move on to Pester 101. So first of all, because mocking generally is useful only in the primary use case for Pester, which was unit testing, as you probably know, or maybe some of you are using Pester for different things. So there are use cases for the validation of your environment. There are use cases for testing your instances, health checks. All those things use Pester as well. But primary mocking is only useful in unit testing, which is the first thing that Pester was created for. Why Pester? Well, Pester is so widely used that if you want to test PowerShell code, there's very little reason to find another module that does the testing, because if you are facing any issues later, it will be so much easier to find somebody that had the same issues in the past. So you can find some resources. You can find it on Stack Overflow. You can find them on Twitter. You can find them on Slack. There will be always people that will know how to help you. Test script is something that you have to be aware. So any test that you write, you will usually land in the test script. This test script, you save them somewhere, and they are usually next to your functions, your scripts, your modules. And then that test script has certain structure. I will just briefly touch on that. So it uses some kind of DSL, domain-specific language, which makes it so much easier for humans to read it. So normally you have containers that are either describe blocks or context blocks. Underneath it, you have something that is called before all, after all, before each, after each, which is just script blocks that will be called before all tests or before each test, depending on the type it shows. And then there are blocks that are actual tests, and this is where you will put your code to test things. Mocks can land in any of those places. Sorry, not in any of those places. That would be Pester 4. In Pester 5, you have to put them in before, after, so after doesn't make any sense. Before, all, before each, or in the end blocks. That's where you would put your mocks, and that's where you will see me doing that. So what is mock? I won't sing it. But overall, the mocks are just ways for you to pretend that reality happens. The problem that you have very often when you test your code is that you not necessarily have Active Directory available. You don't necessarily have your database available. And your code depends on it, especially our production code very often depend on you being able to reach out somewhere and perform certain operations because let's say you run it as your admin account and you expect things to work, but when you test your code, first of all, they might not work. And second of all, probably sometimes you maybe don't want them to work. So that's when the mocking steps in. You generally just use mocking to pretend things happen and kind of isolate away things that you don't want to test. Because your unit testing, the main concept of unit testing is that you want to just test the code that you wrote. You don't want to test get aid user if it gets you aid user, because somebody else should do the work for that. You don't want to test if the involves DBA SQL query actually did invoke SQL query, because that's what the DBA tools guys are responsible for, and they should test it that it actually does what it's supposed to. So what you want to do really, you want to test your code, and therefore you probably want to hide or pretend behaviors of those functions or commands that you didn't write. Okay. So, the concepts. So I will try to explain to you what the main reasons, how the mocking really helps you. So first thing that you would sometimes do with, very often do with mocking, is that you want to have some predictable results. The way you structure a test, you run certain code, you expect something to happen, and you usually validate it using should keyword with some assertions. It's difficult if you would say, have a code, for example, that writes to the log files, and the log files are generated based on the date, and then you would have to write a test that knows what date you were running tests on. that thing would probably not work. So you want to make sure that, for example, getDate will always return the same result in your testing framework, because otherwise things fall apart. The second thing is that, I'm not sure how you approach that, but we generally run our codes on something like called Bamboo, which is just yet another CI/CD platform. There are other platforms like this as well. What we don't want to do on those platforms is install all the modules that we use in our code. That would be ridiculous because there are so many of them, and some of them require for you to install Active Directory module requires RSAT to be installed. The module that we use for SCOM expects you to install MSI package. Imagine installing all this junk on your build agents. That doesn't make any sense. So if you want to test the code that you might not have, that's when the mocking might help you. Another thing I mentioned before is that when you run your tests, you not only don't want things to change, you don't want to depend on things changing the world, you very often don't even want to be risking that something will actually happen. So you don't want to connect to your production SQL instance and drop databases on it just because your tests were wrong and were run on the wrong account. That's something you want to avoid. So then you want to avoid changing the world. And also you want to build a fake world. So again, if you run it in some build agent that doesn't have access to certain things, and you cannot depend on it being able to talk to those technologies, you also want to pretend, okay, if you are doing this, this is what you should get. I'm going to fake it for you so you don't have to rely on this link to work. Because, for example, your build agents are in the development environment, isolated from everything else, so you cannot talk to certain things in your organization because of that, and therefore the code itself would never work there, and you still want to be able to test. Okay, so let's look at those concepts. Let's look at some examples of that. So I set this predictable results. So I have this very simple script here. So if you look at this two tests, the first one, try to assume that it's already Christmas. We run the code, and because today is obviously not Christmas, the result is not what we would want to see there. The second one, I try to fake it, and therefore, because I mocked getDate in a way that it allows me to specify what date is today, according to me, that test worked. So this is one of the situations where you would like to have predictable results, therefore you're gonna mock something that you run inside of your code to make sure that it actually results with the thing that you want to see. Okay, let's go back. By the way, all the code will be available later, so you can look at those Pesters. The Pester codes, code that I have in this presentation is not great. It's just boilerplate, and it's not that interesting. It's more interesting the mocks, and I will show you most of them later. So, as I mentioned, you want to avoid changing things. So let's say I created this nice function. I specified what if just in case, but overall, that's what you sometimes have, right? You write the code that might potentially break things. And you want to only run it for actual production scenarios. You don't want to run it in the test scenarios. So let's say you have something that removes the home share from users when they are leaving company, right? You don't want that to run every day, every time when you run your tests framework. So you want to pretend like you are doing that, but not really do anything at all. So if we run the tests, as you can see, if I didn't mock it properly or didn't mock it at all, what will happen, it will just try to tell me, okay, C Windows has children and then blah, blah, blah. Are you sure you want to do that? So obviously I'm gonna cautiously say no to all. Otherwise then my presentation would be really bad to watch. And the next thing you can see that the next test I run just specifies I'm not going to touch C Windows because it's recognized, okay, you are in the test, so I mocked it in a way that it doesn't do anything. As I mentioned, we can also build fake worlds. So let's say here I'm just saying, okay, I remove database again, something that would normally, it would be ideal to do that in the production environment. So if I run my tests, the first one is that the first test will actually try to connect to so it try to get database and then try to shove it into remove database. But because I have no access to the to any instance, the result of the first command was null, and then the first command just resulted in it crashed basically because it didn't have anything to work with. In your code, you very often write your code in a way that, okay, I'm running in my code, and this is I'm getting this object, and then I'm using it in another command and another command and another command. If the first one fails, everything falls apart, and it can happen in your testing framework because there you don't have access to SQL database, or you just mock things, or just run with some Pester instance that doesn't exist anywhere, and therefore your test will fail every time. So if we just pretend that we have this get database, so we'll mock it with something that is not null, then the next command will work. So this is basically what we want to do with mocking. Any questions so far? Nope? Great. Okay, let's move on to rules. I'm going to spend a bit more time on this one. So the first rule of mocking is that scope matters. And again, that one is important for Pester 5. Why it's important? Well, actually, I think that this is a huge nice feature in the Pester 5. Obviously, during migration, that can bite you in the behind because you assume certain things will leak. But once you get used to it, you start appreciating that because you know that whenever you define mock in the given scope, it will only change the behavior of the command in this given scope. It won't leak anywhere else. So you have to remember, there was the describe block, there was context block, and you can nest context in context, and so on and so forth. And every time you create before all, it will put itself in the queue. So if the first one in describe block, or actually before in describe block, you can have before all. In the before describe, you can have before all. In the context block, you can have before all. All of those will one by one define your mocks, assuming that you have mocks in them. Then you have your it block, which can also define a mocks inside of it. And you have to remember that all of those kind of usually go in the line. And the important thing to remember is that when you mock things in Pester, the idea is that if you have something specific, I will show you in a minute how to become a specific with your mocks. Those specifics, if they match, they will win. If you don't have specific mocks, so like catch all mock, that one will be the last one to be used, but it's always going to be the first one it finds in this list. So if it goes, it will go up the list. So if you have a catch all mock in your context block and in your describe block, the one in the context block will win. If you have one in describe block and outside, the one in describe block will win. So you have to remember that this changes. Obviously, it makes sense to put it like this if you have multiple context blocks, and then you kind of want to have like default behavior of the command that you mock, and then in certain contexts you want to change it. So we very often write our code in a way that we have a context where we just test our error handling, right? So in the context of error handling, we usually mock all the commands that could fail with something that resembles their failure. So we can make sure that our error handling works the way we would expect it to. If we have context where we want to test the default behavior, we will do something else. If there might be another context where we want to test specific parameter set, where we just have different scenarios where the certain things are different than in other places, then we would mock the certain commands differently. Let's say I want to test behavior when I normally take the data from Active Directory, but if that fails, I go to a SQL database, right? In order to make that test possible, I would have to first mock the get AD user, for example, with something that would just not have a result at all. And then I'm sure that my command that should go to the SQL and that if that happens, will actually go to the SQL because that mock forced it to go there. fake it good. So the very important thing about mocking is that, especially for commands that should return results, you should try to make the mock as close to the reality as possible. Why? The main reason for that is if you mock it wrong and make certain assumptions about the result of your command, and that will make your test succeed, but when you put this code in production, it will fail. For example, let's say you grab an object and you assume that certain property will always be a string, right? So you mock it, you put a string there, it's all nice in your tests, but what really happens is that certain commands, let's say AD commands, they will return certain fields as arrays of strings, which normally is just one, but so it looks like it's a string, but it's not. Then your code will succeed in your tests, but when you run it in production, it will fail because, well, you will, instead of actually getting the string, you will get array, and certain things don't like it. So that's something that you have to remember. So whenever you mock your commands, try to observe the behavior of the command that you are mocking, and try to make sure that once you write those mocks, they actually resemble as much as possible the things that are real. That way, you will prevent yourself from making a perfect test framework that always succeeds and all your tests are green. Remember, the purpose of your test is not to make the tests happy, it's to make you happy after you put the code in production. So red test is better than green tests that result in the outage, definitely. Don't mock absent. What do I mean by that? It's going to show as a theme across all the slides I will have in the future. So one of the things that hits a lot of people in Pester is that whenever you try to mock something, the command that you mock have to exist. I will show you later how to do that without actually installing everything, because I mentioned that we don't do that. So there has to be a way to do that without installing every module that exists on Earth to make sure that they work. But the point is that you have to keep that in mind when you write your tests. And the problem is that you very often find yourself writing your tests on your let's say, operator workstation when you have RSAT installed, you have DBA tools installed, you have everything installed. You write your tests, all goes well. You put it in the pipeline, all breaks. And then what? So keep in mind that whenever you do mock something, you have to make sure that you don't necessarily test it in your full-fledged console. My idea usually is just to start PowerShell minus no profile to make sure that no modules are installed, usually in the account that doesn't have access to certain things. Run it there. If the test works, I know that it will probably work in the test pipeline, but at least I'm preventing myself from putting things in my mocks that will not work on the build agents, or forces me to go to the workarounds that I will mention later. And there's a trade-off, right? When you mock your functions, you prevent them from doing something. And there are two ways to approach that. I usually struggle between the two because there are some benefits to both. But you can either just dump something to test drive or something like that, so just pretend that you did it. So instead of removing a DBA database, you just save to text file database remove.txt, what was the parameters for this given database. Alternatively, you can just use should invoke, and that allows you to see, okay, did I run this command? Did I run it with the right parameters? Did I run it in the right order? That's tricky. I'm not sure that you can do that. But basically, you can do definitely did I call my commands that I wanted to call in this context, in this scenario. So what I mentioned before, with this idea, okay, if you don't find the user in AD, you go to SQL. Let's say you want to verify that if actually the user is found in AD, the SQL command is not being called. You can do that by just should invoke. So in one scenario, you should invoke get AD user and then should invoke SQL because you want to check SQL. And in other contexts, when the get AD user returns something that is sufficiently good, then you don't expect the SQL command to be called. So those things are something that you should keep in mind. Pitfalls. Okay, so I mentioned that we have this idea of missing commands. So as you can see, I don't have get aid user on this machine. This is my home laptop. It doesn't necessarily talk to Active Directory very often, so I didn't have any incentive to install AD Active Directory module on this box. So let's create a command that will actually use this command and try to test it. So as you can probably predict, my tests will fail. And they will fail with the information that could not find command. Why? Well, I tried to mock something I don't have. So this scenario I mentioned before, right? So the way to approach that, the very basic way to approach that is just to create a fake command. And right now I will do something nasty, so this command is not going to be that similar to get aid user as it's supposed to. I can show you what it actually does. So as you can see, that doesn't necessarily return any AD objects. And this doesn't do anything that doesn't resemble the actual behavior. So this is the worst mock you can have. But at least with this command present, now I can invoke my Pester and actually mock it properly, and then it will just do something that I would expect it to, right? So if you have a situation that the function is missing, well, there's a way around it, and I will show you the better way than the one I just did here. Next thing, okay, let's just remove this fake AD user because it's really awful. Another thing that you sometimes have is, let's say, remember this get date idea? So I found my colleagues and myself as well, very often like, okay, what's the easiest way to produce a predictable date? Well, you can just run get date and then specify the string and we'll convert it to a nice date, right? Well, there's a slight problem there because you're mocking get date, but you're using get date in it, right? So guess what happens? Well, it takes some time before it happens, but when it happens, you can see that it just tried to call itself, and then I believe the limit is 1000. Fortunately, we have this limit, otherwise we would end up with endless loop and it would never finish. So that's convenient, but it doesn't solve the problem. So there are obviously ways around it, and that's something that's generally what we do. We just use datetime class and we cast the string to it, and then it works. Another thing is that some pipeline, when you use pipeline in your functions, in your scripts, you will find yourself very often in a situation where you mock something, you think it should work, but it doesn't work at all, you get error messages. And the reason for that is because the pipeline binding can be tricky at times, especially when you work with sim commandlets. Those guys tend to be very picky about the object that they accept. So I can show you in a minute how that works. So I have this nice idea here. I want to get, oh really? I want F8, not 8. So I want to get all the partitions on the given, all the disks that I have in my machine, which works perfectly fine. And I will call that one. Don't worry about reading it. I have copied the output that it's interesting. That's by the way to figure out what your command is doing. Very useful in mocking. So when you try to figure out, okay, I have this command. It doesn't necessarily behave the way I want it to. I have the parameter binding, pipeline binding, and I don't know what happened. That's a very useful way to trace it. And I copied just the interesting part here. So you can see that it actually tried to bind a lot of things, but the thing that succeeded is that it bound the resulting disk instance to disk parameter. The reason why it managed to do that is because the type of the disk that the result of the actual get disk command is something that you can use later in get partition. If you would mock it, and you would mock it, well, resembling the reality enough, your whole pipeline will not work. So let's just create a simple function that does that exactly. So it just gets some get disk, then get partitions from it, and just create some nice object from it. So if I would run it here, let's try very quick, get disk info. So that's expected behavior, that it will actually do something like that, right? So it gives me the name of my disk, serial number, model, and then all the partitions on disk. May be convenient for certain inventory script that you might have. And then if we call that, well, as you can see, it complains that input object cannot be bound, blah, 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 blah. We're not going to read the whole text. What it means that my get disk mocked command resulted in something, sorry guys. Yeah, that normally would be the call for my colleague. What I wanted to say is that the get disk would result with the object that get partition can accept, but my mock of get disk was nowhere near what the get partition get partition expected. That's why the binding didn't work. And the last but not least, something that I definitely struggle with, and I haven't found a perfect solution for that at all, is when you have functions like that. That's a very nice function, but the problem with this one is that it doesn't use any PowerShell commands. Mocking PowerShell commands is easy. Let me rephrase it. Mocking PowerShell commands is possible. Mocking classes, not necessarily. So if you have a code like this, you might have really huge struggles to mock it. And in the next slide, I will show you how to maybe fix it. So ideas. So first of all, stop modules. I have a nice function here. I will share it later. But what it does, I'm not sure if I define it. Let's just define it very quick. So the function, what it does, it just takes the commands that you have on your own box. So let's say you are on this operator workstation and you have access to Active Directory module, DBA tools, VMware tools, all those PowerShell, what you name it. And then what you want to do is just, okay, I want to put it in the pipeline, but I don't want to install DBA tools on it. So let's just make sure that my DBA tools is stubbed. So the way we do that is just, we produce this very simple function, which just has param block. That is important because in the mocking you will need it. If you don't have proper param block, the whole mocking will fail because it will try to mock parameters you don't have. And that also doesn't work very well. And because it sometimes uses some types that we might not have, what we try to do is whenever we see type we don't recognize, we just replace it with the system object as a collection or just object if it's just a singleton. And what we do from there, this module will always throw, right? So it will make sure that if you don't mock properly, it will not proceed and try to not do anything. It will force you to mock from this point onwards all your commands you don't have. Those modules can be just then put, as you can see here, I was just putting in the stop.psm1, and what you have to remember is that when you have your code in your testing framework, so when you test your code, you have to replace the import module with the importing this guy. So the actual module is not, there is no attempt to import it. This one is replacing it. And then you can just move on from there. You don't have to worry about mocking anything because you have all the commands that you want to mock. One thing to keep in mind is that this one is obviously not versioned, so if the version of the module changes, you have to update it. We did this mistake with DBA tools actually, because we were using the older version, then we somebody installed newer version, we tried to run mocks, and then some commands we couldn't mock them because they were not there. Well, that was because we just had a stop module that had the functions that disappeared in version 1 and didn't have the functions that were added in version 1. As you probably know, there was some renaming in DBA tools between version 0 point something and version 1. Something that Jesse mentioned yesterday. Okay, so next thing I want to share with you is this idea of catch-all and param filter mocks. So the reason why we try to do that in all of our tests is that you sometimes, first of all, you want to replace the behavior of the command when it's being called with the specific parameters, because sometimes you have the commands that it's called multiple times. Like, let's say you have something that talks to the REST framework with different APIs. So obviously, when you invoke REST method, you don't want to mock it with the same behavior every time, because that will not work. If you go to one API first and then the second API second, and all of those will result with the same, your code will be completely messed up. So what you want to do is just make sure that whenever the API URI is correct, then you just do the right thing. But if you do this, then you might miss actual command that is not mocked, and then you can potentially run things in production when you didn't intend it to. So I have this nice function here, remove annoying database, and I'm going to try to test it. And what you will see in the first one, as you can see, its context is winged for a reason. So in this case, I didn't add this catch-all mock, and I made a typo in my test. And that's just minor thing, and I was testing it with my app account, because why not? I mean, what could possibly go wrong? And as you can see here, it tried to connect to prod. Probably not the great things in the world, and I'm pretty sure that it would try to remove the super important database as well, if I would allow that. Fortunately, obviously, my laptop doesn't have connection to our production environment, and obviously the names in our production environment is nowhere near what we have here, but you get the point, right? If you don't have this catch-all mock, then you might end up in a situation where you just accidentally try to do things. And the way we do that is just this mock, like catch-all mock will just throw, and that's what you can see in the second thing, where I just say unexpected parameter values, because I didn't specify anything, so it will go with the defaults. So this is for catch-all. And now for this, the problem with pipeline. So there are two ways to approach that. One works sometimes. The second one works very well for all the SIM modules. So first of all, if you don't know how to approach that, first of all you can check your commands. Then you can check what they expect. And as you can see here, this one expects SIM instance of the type hash MSFT disk, which means that it wants a SIM instance of the class MSFT_disk. So I can fake it in two ways. First of all, I can just do it with the PS type name. And then if you look at this one, it looks like I have a 1 petabyte disk in my laptop. Yay! Which is obviously not true, unfortunately. But I can fake it, and PowerShell will look at it and it will think it's a disk. The problem is that sometimes when you want to provide this with the properties, they will not work as expected. As you can see here, it complains that this partition style is something that it couldn't set. And let's say I want to have my test that actually just checks, okay, if the partition style is row, just do something. If it's not, don't do anything. Well, I'm kind of have a problem here on my hands, and that's where new SIM instance is very useful. New SIM instance is the command that allows you to create instances of the SIM classes, and there is a very nice parameter for that one, which is called client only, which means that it just creates a kind of container. It doesn't create anything on your laptop or on your machine at all. It just creates a data structure that resembles the given class. And okay, I will get to that. But you don't even have to have this class on your machine at all. So if I do this, as you can see now, I got the partition style GPT, as you can see at the end. Well, that's what the partition style 2 is mapped to. And we can do a lot of crazy things. For example, we had a weird instance where we were doing some operations on DNS, and we wanted to make sure that certain errors are caught and produce different behavior than others. So with this, I could actually mock what the get DNS server resource record would actually do, like one-to-one, and make sure that if I test it in my try catch, I actually, when something else happens, I still throw, but then when that happens, I just ignore it, right? So that I can mock this behavior. And I mentioned that I can work with the things I don't have. I don't have SCCM installed here, obviously, but I can just create the class. It won't have the formatting that we had with disk, because for that one I have locally installed module, but it still produces an object that I could shove in another command and mock it like this, and that command will be completely happy to accept those results and do something with it. And so for the last one, there's this problem with this the code that I show you with the classes. So the way to approach that is just rewrite your code, unfortunately. At least to my knowledge, there's no easier way to do that. So the way we normally do that is just replace this ::new calls with just new object. The difference is that new object is not as great when it comes to performance and stuff like this, but at least it's a PowerShell command, which means that you're now kind of walking around the problem that you don't use classes anymore, right? So use command, you can mock it, you can pretend it, and then it works. So if I just run the test now, I have a special test for that here. So now, as you can see, the test worked because I was able to mock new object in a way that it actually produced the nicer results. Okay, I have one more, but maybe there are some questions. We have just like 4.5 minutes left in this session, so I want to check if you guys have any questions. Go ahead.
So, when you mock functions that you're calling, say, DBA tools, if there's any changes that happen to those functions, how do you anticipate those in your mocks? Is there like another level of testing after the fact that uses those functions, or is it just kind of you have to keep aware of what's actually going to be changed in the future?
Okay, so the question was, how do you keep track of the actual real modules when you create stops for yourself? And if something changes there, how would you reflect that in the production code? Well, we are fortunate enough to use DSC for all our production, so we know exactly which version of the module is deployed. So then we can just make sure that this version of the module, and we try to keep it consistent across the environment, that one is in the stop. So whenever we go in production, we know that's the version we will have there, and we know that this stop is updated. So unless we forget, obviously, but then at least it's so much easier because we know exactly, okay, we had this 0 point something, now we need to have 1 point something, and we just swap the one with the other, and we are sure that we are running the right code. That's a very good question. Go ahead.
For classes that cannot be created with the new instance monolith, would it be possible to just add type?
Yeah, that's what I did. So the question was for this classes created with the object created with the new sim instance. The question was, can you just add PS type name and just fake them like that, right? Is that the question?
But you can do it after object creation too.
Yeah. Yeah, but actually, so let me go scroll up. So I actually used PS custom object with PS type name, and that works. That's why we got this disk. So that's definitely one way to do that. So you see here, that's what you're referring to, right? PS type name, and then you just fake it to be like. But then you may run into problems like I had with this partition style, that you cannot do that for certain things because it will try to do some crazy stuff that doesn't work if you have this module installed. It won't be a problem if you don't have it, because then it won't do anything like that. It will just create an object that looks like given type, so with a given class. But for example, the get disk, that's something that's installed on all those servers. So even our agents had it, and we had to make sure that we use new sim instance to make sure. Another thing is that you very often have with this new sim instance, you can also specify your keys. And those can be very important when you run your code later, because the certain pipeline chains will require you to have keys in the right places. So you can specify a new sim instance, and then you specify which properties are keys, and then it creates an instance that looks exactly like the one that you have in your production environment. And if you don't have it, then certain things tend to fail. So that's two situations where new sim instances might be better than just adding the PS type name. But PS type name most of the time will be sufficient, because then you can just fake the type, and everything is happy because it looks like the type that you want to produce. Okay, do we have some? Oh, we have 1 minute, so it's going to be very quick. So I have one more. So I mentioned that this classes we can just do new object, but there's one more thing that you can do, especially for the classes that you don't really have at all. So here I have a function that calls non-existing class on my box. So if I run it here, it will obviously fail because I never created class foobar whatever, right? So it's complaining that this class doesn't exist. So back in PowerShell 2 and I think in PowerShell 3, we did a nice trick. I think I learned that from Joel Bennett. So you can pretend like you can add mappings to the classes that exist to the classes that you have. Sorry, to the names of the classes you can map names of the classes to the classes that you actually produce. This is where nice use of PowerShell classes, because what I'm doing here, I just created mine class. This is just for mocking, right? I'm attaching to the non-public class because normally I wouldn't be able to see it. And next thing I do is I just add this one to my session, replace the foobar, whatever, with my class. And if I do that and I run my tests, they will work, because now it's just like maps that foobar, whatever, to mine, does mine colon. So it's very useful when you have something like, you have some classes that have factories, for example, and you need to use factory in order to do something, and you cannot really swap it. Another way to do that is just to write a simple PowerShell command that will just do this mapping and mock that one, and then you won't be able to test it, but it's so simple that you don't even have to, right? Because it just does run constructor of the class and does that only. Okay, we went through the QA, so I guess we are over time, so I'm going to leave this room because otherwise Jakub will have to wait for me. Thank you all for attending. Thank you for joining me. If you want to have, again, more about Pester knowledge, there will be a person in this room next that has more knowledge about Pester than I do and I will ever have. So you can ask him questions and maybe just confirm that things I said are not so wrong that as you might think. So thank you for joining, and see you later.